Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this briefing on women's rights in the Middle East and Afghanistan. I extend a special welcome to our panelists, who I will introduce shortly. As many of you know, I co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the United States House of Representatives, and in that capacity, I propose to hold a hearing on today's topic. The commission operates on the principle of bipartisan consensus, and unfortunately, the Republican co-chair opposed that proposal. For that reason, I've decided to convene this special briefing on this important topic. It should need to be emphasized that protecting and fulfilling women's human rights around the world is of the utmost importance. After decades of progress here in the United States, we are currently seeing a concerted strategy to roll back women's rights. But I want to be clear that women and their allies will not be silenced, and those efforts will not succeed. Women's rights in the Middle East and Afghanistan have been in the news quite a bit in recent years. In 2018, it was the Saudi government's unprecedented crackdown on well-known women's rights activists who were advocating for the lifting of the driving ban on women. 13 women were detained, including the sister of one of our panelists today, and remained in prison for up to 3 years. During the first 3 months, several endured torture, sexual abuse, and ill treatment, and were denied access to their families and lawyers. The women were eventually released, the last two in June of 2021, but they remain subject to travel bans and other restrictions on their freedoms. Then in August 2021, the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. The aftermath has been devastating for women. 2 months ago, UN experts reported that nowhere else in the world has there been an attack as widespread, systematic, and all-encompassing on the rights of women and girls as in Afghanistan. The Taliban have sought to ban education for women and girls above the primary level. They have banned women from working for the United Nations. Women may not drive more than 45 miles nor fly without a male relative. They are banned from public parks and gyms, and in June, all women's beauty salons were shut down by decree. The intentional deprivation of rights is extremely severe, and there is no apparent end in sight. And then in September 2022, Mahsa Amini, a 26-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman, was arrested by Iran's morality police for allegedly violating the country's mandatory hijab law. She died after reportedly having been beaten in custody. The massive women-led protests that followed and their violent repression attracted global attention to the situation of women in Iran. Hundreds of protesters were killed and thousands arrested. According to reports, women in detention have been subjected to rape and gender-based violence. These situations are not all the same, but when we step back and look broadly, there are elements in common. And it turns out that women in the MENA, in the MENA region, fare worse than women in most other regions in measurable ways. They are subject to the greatest degree of legal discrimination in the world, and Afghanistan is even worse. They have the lowest rate of labor force participation globally, with average unemployment rates nearly double those of men. They hold the lowest percentage of seats in national legislatures of any region in the world. They reportedly experience the highest rates of intimate partner violence in the world, and among the highest rates of child, early, and forced marriage. Excuse me. And women's mobility and ability to travel is restricted by the male guardian system. The panelists today will discuss the status of women's rights in greater depth in 5 countries: Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. It's worth noting that all except Iran have ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW. And in the interest of full disclosure, the United States signed CEDAW in 1980 and has not yet ratified it. The first objective of this briefing is to learn more about the realities that women face in these countries. Not all the news is bad, but much of it is. The second objective is to ask how we can most constructively support women who are fighting for their rights in these countries and throughout the region. For the last 20 years, many members of Congress have strongly supported U.S. efforts to contribute to positive change for women. This was especially true in Afghanistan. it is important to ask where we go from here. And so now I'm happy to introduce our panelists. Lina Al-Hathlul is a Saudi activist and head of monitoring and advocacy at Al-Kist for human rights, an independent NGO that promotes human rights in Saudi Arabia and the wider Gulf region. Ms. Al-Hathlul holds a master's degree in law from the Université, from the Free University of Brussels. Excuse me. She has worked as a legal advisor to several companies, including Ernst & Young and startups, and as a policy analyst with Access Now. She's the co-author of the book Lujan Dreams of Sunflowers. Excuse me. Secondly, Samira Hamidi is the regional campaigner for Amnesty International's South Asia Regional Office, where she focuses on the human rights situation in Afghanistan and covers women's rights, freedom of expression, refugee and migrants' rights, and international human rights mechanisms, protection and relief for human rights defenders. Her previous positions included Program and Advocacy Director at Empowerment Center for Women and Country Director for Afghan's Women's Network. And she's the founder, the chair of Human Rights Defenders Committee. She holds a master's of advanced studies in mediation in peace processes from ETH Zurich, and an LLM in international human rights law and practice from the University of York in the UK. Elam Yousefian is a blind human rights lawyer from Iran. She has studied and practiced law in Iran, representing clients in a variety of areas, including criminal and family cases. She also works as a part-time journalist and advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. She engaged in a successful campaign leading to the adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities by the government of Iran in 2008. Ms. Yousefian graduated from the London School of Economics with a master's in human rights and has worked with different organizations, including the Danish Institute for Human Rights, Danish Refugee Relief, and Human Rights Watch. And she's currently works as humanitarian disaster risk reduction and climate action senior advisor in the International Disability Alliance. Rathna Begum is a senior women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch. She focuses on discrimination and violence against women and girls in the Middle East and North Africa, in the North Africa region, including leading the research and advocacy on the abuse and exploitation of migrant domestic workers, domestic violence, child marriage, sexual violence and conflict, discriminatory family laws, and male guardianship policies. She has conducted research and advocacy in countries including Iraq, Japan, Kuwait, Qatar, Lebanon, Morocco, Oman, Palestine, and the United Arab Emirates and Yemen. She also has led the advocacy for Human Rights Watch on a new global international labor organization treaty relating to violence and harassment at work, which was adopted in June 2019. Ms. Begum holds an LLB in law and an LLM in legal theory from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And before I turn to Ms. Al-Hathlul to begin, I just want to make an announcement here that that for those who are watching, who would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be tracking questions, and and they'll be texted to me, and I will then forward them to our panelists. So that's how we will do this. So let me begin with Lina Al-Hathlul to begin. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for organizing this very important briefing, Mr. Congressman McGovern. So I'll be focusing on Saudi Arabia. Since the launch of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, women's rights have been at the center of the discourse around reforms. The vision describes women as another great asset and states that it aims to empower women. Although the Saudi authorities have lifted some of the restrictions women face under the country's male guardianship system, including allowing women to apply for their own passports, as well as relaxing strict gender segregation in public spaces and allowing women to drive, the male guardianship system, a legal framework that treats adult women as minors, continues to negatively affect all aspects of women's lives and severely restrict their fundamental liberties. Reforms have been announced supposedly to protect women from abuse, but they lack adequate means of enforcement, leaving many women trapped in abusive relationships. Disobedience by a woman towards her male guardian, so the father, the husband, brother, or even son, also remains a crime, effectively rendering their new freedoms null and void if her male guardian objects. Such a complaint, so a disobedience complaint by a male guardian, can lead a woman being detained in dar al-ri'aya, literally translated as care homes. The reasons for which girls and young women are referred to dar al-ri'aya include taghayyub, meaning to be absent or absconding or running away from home, engaging in an act of moral indecency such as extramarital sexual relations, committing murder, or uquq, meaning disobeying a male guardian. The case of Shayma here, Shayma al-Bukmi, is very telling. Shayma had been a victim of domestic violence, including threats by her father to kill her, and as there are no shelters to protect women victims of domestic abuse, she had left her house to live independently. Her father later reported that she had run away from home. Shayma was arrested and has been missing since. Moreover, given that women are now allowed to apply for their own passports, we have seen that this led to an exponential increase in the number of women fleeing the country, either for domestic reasons or political ones. One recent example that has gained international attention is that of Fawz al-Ataibi, one of Saudi Arabia's most famous influencers. Fawz and her sister Manahel were summoned and charged for not wearing a abaya, the long black dress, and for tweeting on feminist hashtags. Fawz fled the country before her arrest, and her sister Manahel has been arrested and is being tried before the Specialized Criminal Court, which is the court dealing with terrorism cases. So more than being applied inconsistently, these changes are taking place in a context in which the space for free speech is virtually non-existent, bearing public debate on key legal reforms and harshly sanctioning anyone who dares speak about their situation or giving their opinion. In fact, there is a significant discrepancy between the reform narrative Saudi Arabia is advertising to the international community and its treatment of civil reform movements internally, on which it continues to harshly crack down. Women who peacefully call for their basic rights continue to be targeted and punished. In recent months, the Saudi courts have convicted and passed long jail sentences on several women over peaceful rights activity on social media, including Salma Shihab here, who has been sentenced to 27 years, Fatma Shawarbi to 30 years, Sukaina Al-Aithan 40 years, and Noura Al-Qahtani 45 years. This comes amid an intensified crackdown on social media activity in general, with the authorities brazenly jailing individuals for peaceful tweets, signaling that nobody is safe. Prominent women human rights defenders, including Naseem Al-Sada, Samar Badawi, and Lujain Al-Hadlul, who's my sister, who have long advocated for women's rights and who were charged and sentenced by the terrorism court for their feminist activism, continue to face heavy restrictions since being released from prison, notably travel bans that prevent them from leaving the country. Moreover, the brutal torture they have endured by state officials has never been investigated. Finally, as analyzed by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, the much-awaited personal status law that was published in 2022 actually enshrines the male guardianship over women and entrenches a system of gender-based discrimination in most aspects of family life, including marriage, divorce, and when making decisions about their children. So if you have any questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Ms. Hamidi, we'll go to you next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Samira Hamidi, and I'm the regional campaigner for South Asia at Amnesty International, and I cover Afghanistan's human rights situation. Amnesty International is an international grassroots human rights organization with more than 10 million members, activists, and supporters around the world. It's an honor to be here today to speak about the devastating effect of institutionalized discrimination on women and girls' lives in Afghanistan since the takeover by the Taliban de facto authorities. I would like to start by thanking the Honorable Congressman McGurn for hosting this important briefing. We appreciate your tireless work for human rights. I also would like to acknowledge and thank my esteemed colleagues that I'm sharing this virtual stage today. The situation of women and girls in Afghanistan, as stated by Congressman, is devastating. Amnesty International and other human rights organizations and experts have documented the severe deterioration of human rights situation of women and girls in Afghanistan since Taliban seized control of Kabul in August 2021. While the Taliban government lacks international recognition, they control the country's government offices and functions and have therefore become Afghanistan's de facto authorities. As such, the Taliban are able to impose oppressive policies systematically and in a widespread manner. The Taliban initial promise to respect women and girls' rights fell away quickly, with the de facto authorities increasingly introducing new restrictions with the apparent aim to completely erasing women and girls' presence in public arena. Any meaningful form of public or political participation by women and girls is now prohibited in Afghanistan. Women are required to travel with a mahram or male shepherd for long distance journey, and the authorities have also issued a decree claiming that women should try to stay at home unless necessary. Women are prevented from moving freely and dressing as they choose. They are banned from education beyond primary schools as well as higher education. In fact, a few days back, we heard that the Taliban are even trying to impose a new ban, which will not allow girls beyond grade 3 to go to school, which is an additional matter of concern for us. Women are excluded from a wider range of professions, including from working with local and international NGOs and the UN offices in Afghanistan, and they are not granted political appointments or public positions. Since return to power, the Taliban has dismantled institutions that were proactively promoting women's rights and providing support to women and girls, especially those facing domestic violence. Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission and the Ministry of Women's Affairs were the two important institutions which do not exist anymore, unfortunately. The discriminatory restrictions alone violate human rights guarantees contained in numerous international treaties to which Afghanistan is a party, including the right to education and work and to freedom of movement, expression, association, and peaceful assembly, as well as the right to equality and non-discrimination. Resistance against these policies has met with brutal reprisal by the Taliban de facto authorities. Women who have protested against Taliban's abusive and restrictive policies have faced extensive force, unlawful arrests, torture, and other ill treatment or punishment to ensure their compliance, leading to violations to the right of freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and public participation. While in detention, women have been subjected to torture and other ill treatments and forced to sign confessions or agreements in which they commit not to protest again. The Taliban's treatment of women's protesters violates a number of rights, including in some instances, the right to be free from torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatments, the right to liberty and security, and the prohibition of enforced disappearances. I would like to especially discuss the finding of our recent report published by Amnesty International and ICJ in May of this year that analyzed the conduct and policies of Taliban leaders towards women and girls. The report covers the period from August 21 to January 23, basing its analysis on a growing body of evidence collected by credible sources, including Amnesty International's 2022 report, Dead and Slow Motion, civil society organizations, and UN authorities. Our findings conclude that the human rights violations documented against women and girls in Afghanistan at the hands of the Taliban may amount to crime against humanity, including most especially the crime of gender persecution under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. I would like to conclude by suggesting a number of recommendations, since this is a very important briefing. My first recommendation focuses on the women and girls who are fleeing from Afghanistan. The women and girls who are fleeing from Afghanistan must be prioritized by international community, especially by United States, who has long committed to support the human rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. They should be provided the immigration their asylum claims should be considered immediately, and they should be provided, their immigration claims should be supported. My second recommendation focuses on pathways. The United States can open pathways to ensure the voices of Afghan women and girls are heard in Washington, including by inviting Afghan women to testify, by meeting with visiting Afghan women activists, and by providing funding to support activists' activities by Afghan women in Afghanistan and abroad, those who are in exile, those who were evacuated in August 2021. My third recommendation is on the upcoming Human Rights Council, which is a very important, which will be another important discussion. We really hope that the United States and other international member states take a proactive role toward establishing an independent international accountability mechanism to investigate crimes under international law and other human rights, serious human rights violations that the Taliban are committing right now, and there has been no accountability on the Taliban's front. In support of accountability, the United States government advanced any effort, whether through an independent mechanism or through other means, to collect and preserve evidence of violations against women and girls in Afghanistan with a view to support future accountability efforts, including persecution and fair trials. This can also include any relevant evidence within the custody of the United States government. I would like to end up my testimony here, and I'll be happy to answer if there will be any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I now will turn to Ms. Yousefian. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to join this esteemed panel. I want to start my remarks by commemorating men and women, girls and boys who lost their lives, who are currently in prison, joining the Women Life Freedom Movement in Iran. Congressman, you mentioned the recent movement, and I want to highlight just two recent developments that I think, in my opinion, actually impact situation of women in Iran recently, because I can talk about many things, but the time is limited. I just wish to highlight that my remarks here are my opinion and not representing my organization's position, because my organization is an organization on rights of persons with disabilities at international level. And my information about the situation in Iran is based on my personal interest, research, and advocacy on my free time, nothing to do with my organization. So the first topic that I want to discuss today is the recent developments in terms of forcing mandatory dress code or hijab on women in Iran. So as you mentioned, Congressman, the Women Life Freedom Movement started by loss of life of Mahsa Amini, Gina. And women started protesting, men joining them by like burning their headscarves, refusing to wear the mandatory hijab. And for a while, the authorities stopped the morality police in the street, just probably as an attempt to calm down the protests. But recently, we are facing a new crackdown on women's activists, and just these are not like even specialized advocates. These are ordinary women in the streets of Iran refusing to wear hijab. And I have heard from many of them telling me directly that that's the only thing that we can do. By refusing to wear this hijab, that's how we can pay our responsibility, play our role towards life of Mahsa and many, many other women and men who lost their lives. And like were tortured, imprisoned during this movement. The government of Iran has recently introduced a new legislation and have actually undermined even the constitutional processes to adopt the law. So it has not even been discussed in the public hearing in the Iran Majlis or the Parliament of Iran. Has gone pretty fast through the cycle of adoption and soon is going to be enforced. This law introduces a number of measures and restrictions on women, prosecuting women for violating the mandatory hijab, defining a vast variety of punishments for women who refuse to wear the hijab, and also providing a lot of like free hand and like possibility to undermine the procedural rules to the judiciary and to the police to prosecute these women. This is very dangerous against the rule of law and human rights. So another example that has been actually included in this law and is going to be introduced recently is to mobilize a new specific police, because many women are actually like refusing to wear hijab when using, for example, the subway in Tehran and in other big cities. So they have mobilized a number of citizens, apparently conservatives, to act against women who are not wearing hijab. This can include like insult and even physical abuse. And then they have the authority and they have the possibility to contact the police and ask them to detain these people. Basically, they're mobilizing citizens against citizens. So we have the cases, very wide number of cases recently being reported of women or men like acting violently against women who are refusing to wear hijab, beating them. There have been cases of people being beaten, being reported to police and being detained just because they are not wearing the headscarf or the dress code that they are forcing women to do that. So this requires extremely urgent action by human rights organizations, by the United Nations, by governments, including the government of the United States, because this is the very basic human rights of a human being to decide what they want to wear, and mobilizing the ordinary citizens who have not even been educated or trained on how to work in these situations can generate a lot of violations and gender-based violence against women. So this requires immediate action. That law also allows a very urgent and very fast-paced prosecution of these women. And many of those convictions by court is going to be even non-appealable. So this is like a law that is going to be passed very quickly and has not been really picked up by the media around the world, that I really draw the attention to it. Another area that I want to mention using this opportunity is recent restrictions on sexual and reproductive rights for women. So we are aware that abortion is not legal in Iran, but women used to access this kind of services, like including contraception, in like through the health system, pretty like with some sort of flexibility. But in recent years, especially the last couple of years, they haven't. The government of Iran has introduced recent policies and laws to restrict access to sexual and reproductive health and rights for women. That includes very, very difficult high prices and very difficult access to contraception. That includes, for example, prescription by the doctor in special cases that are like related to health. And this is not something that people can just go and pick up from every pharmacy. And more concerning is the new law and policy that they have introduced in the collaboration between the Ministry of Health and the police and the judiciary, which actually requires all labs that record the information of every single woman who tests positive for pregnancy in a database. And they have initiated this, they calling that they are that we are trying to preserve the fundamental of the family. So this woman information is going to be recorded. They're going to chase and make sure that the pregnancy is not being ended. And many gynecologists, the health care practitioners in Iran are mentioning that it's been very, very difficult for them, and they refuse to provide these kind of services, including abortion, to women, even to those who are who become pregnant as a result of rape or sexual abuse in the family. So this is really concerning. Putting that on the top of the economic situation in Iran, which is deteriorating, and the prices that are going up and up, and the work opportunities for women is very, very limited and getting more and more limited as days pass. You can take a picture of the situation of women in Iran right now. I just want to end my briefing by highlighting the special situation of women with disabilities in Iran. So the economic situation plus a lack of law to protect women, including women with disabilities, from violence. And then recent reports that have been published from the institutions that women with disabilities are being kept from cases of extreme violence and abuse against people with disabilities, including women, are really alarming. We have in the briefing today that this is the situation of women in the Middle East is worse than situation of women in other parts and worse than the situation of men in the Middle East. So I want to mention that the situation of women with disabilities in the region is probably worst of the worst of the worst. Thank you so much, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. Ms. Begum, we welcome you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you to everyone for joining this very important conversation. As you all have just heard, women in Afghanistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia continue to fight against severe discrimination and violence. Discriminatory laws and practices such as male guardianship policies, in which a woman is required to have a male guardian, could be a father, brother, uncle, or husband, to make decisions on her behalf, provides men with control over women's lives. This enables domestic violence while denying women their legal autonomy and rights. In a recent report that we issued in July, Human Rights Watch found that many Middle East and North African countries still prevent women from moving freely within their own country or from traveling abroad without the permission of a male guardian. I will speak to Iraq and the UAE, who are among those who have discrimination against women, including male guardianship, firmly rooted in law and which facilitates domestic violence. In Iraq, under the Personal Status Law, a woman can lose her right to spousal maintenance from her husband if she refuses his request to move into his home, leaves her husband's home without his permission, or refuses to travel with him without a legitimate excuse. Women fleeing violence in Iraq without any legal identification documents within their own country face great challenges, including to freely move around, register for residency permits, which is required to rent housing or secure employment, obtain birth certificates for their children, or even to access some forms of healthcare. Now, there are very few government shelters in Iraq, which exist only in the Kurdistan region for women victims of violence, and they are only allowed to enter and leave with a court order. The NGO-run shelters for victims of violence in federal Iraq are subject to attacks by extremist groups, and they also face raids by police, in which police may send survivors back to their families that they had fled from. Despite high rates of domestic violence and femicides, Iraq still has a draft law on domestic violence pending for years. They have important protections such as restraining orders, but still have problematic provisions and gaps, including prioritizing reconciliation over protection and justice for survivors. Iraq's criminal code, moreover, allows husbands and parents to punish their wives and discipline their children within certain limits. It has reduced sentences for violent acts, including murder, for so-called honorable motives, and allows rapists and perpetrators of sexual assault to escape prosecution or conviction if they marry their victim. One 18-year-old woman in Iraq told us in October 2019 that her brother had forced her to marry a friend of his at age 14. She said the police and a local judge refused to help when she told them that her husband beat her and forced her into prostitution. After she fled and went into hiding, she said her brother wanted to kill her. It is normal in my family to kill someone. My grandfather killed his sister and my uncle killed his sister, she told us. The US should support women in Iraq and call on authorities to repeal discriminatory laws, pass a strong domestic violence law, and ensure support for survivors, including shelters. Now, in the United Arab Emirates, some women are able to exercise key freedoms, but this is not the case for all. Now, the UAE has made reforms in recent years, but they still continue to discriminate against women, including male guardianship policies. For instance, some state universities require women to have parental or male guardian permission for off-campus activities, such as joining field trips or conducting work experience, or leaving campus accommodation. Under the Federal Person Status Law, women are required to have a male guardian's permission to marry, and she can lose her right to spousal maintenance from her husband if she abandons a marital home, prevents her husband from entering it, refuses to have sexual relations with him without a lawful excuse, or does not maintain the family home or breastfeed their children. In 2020, the UAE amended its law to provide that foreign nationals who marry in another country can have that country's law apply to them in matters of marriage and divorce, unless one of the spouses is a UAE national. In 2021, the Abu Dhabi authorities issued a law for their state, providing for a civil marriage with improved protections for women. However, it only applies to non-Muslim foreign national couples residing in Abu Dhabi. As such, it discriminates against women based on their religion, nationality, and where they reside. In December 2021, the UAE issued a new penal code, but it reintroduced the criminalization of consensual non-marital sex. Men and women who have sex outside of marriage can be punished with at least 6 months imprisonment, allowing judges discretion to provide harsher sentences. It can only be prosecuted on the basis of a complaint by a husband or male guardian, ensuring that men still hold power to punish women. In December 2019, the UAE finally adopted a domestic violence law that introduced some positive provisions, such as restraining orders, but it still preserves men's guardianship of women. Similar to Saudi Arabia's 2013 domestic violence law, the UAE's law defines abuse or domestic violence as that which exceeds the bounds of guardianship, allowing authorities to decide what is acceptable discipline or violence by male guardians of their wives and female relatives. It also prioritizes reconciliation over safety of the victim, as it requires proposing conciliation between the victim and the abuser before any criminal action is pursued. The US authorities should support women in the UAE, particularly calling on the authorities to repeal discriminatory laws, including male guardianship for all women, and ensure that women have effective protections from violence. Without such actions by governments, discriminatory laws and policies will continue to have a brutal, lethal cost on women and girls. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your excellent testimony. And this, as I said at the outset, is an incredibly important topic because we need to make sure that people appreciate the fact that women's rights are human rights. And sometimes I feel, even in the United States, that that is not always a shared principle here. But in any event, I have some questions, some individual questions, and some questions for the panel. So I'll begin with Ms. Al Hathul. You've provided a strong critique of the reforms in Saudi Arabia. And those reforms have gotten a lot of positive press here in the United States. Do you see any advances that are real or sustainable, and how should we respond here when we're told that the reforms have been so positive?
Thank you very much for this very important question. I think that there has been changes, but we can't call them reforms. You can't reform a country without civil society. I think that there were top-down changes that are implemented inconsistently. So, for example, as I stated, there's the example of Fawzia Atebi, who had to flee the country to talk about her sister who's in prison for not wearing a abaya. And this atmosphere of fear of Muslim civil society makes it very difficult for us to really state and give names. But we have documented many cases of women who have been arrested because of what the police considers as indecent acts. So, for example, everyone has applauded the fact that the religious police doesn't have power anymore. But what happened actually is that they gave new prerogatives to the normal police, which is if a policeman deems an act to be indecent publicly, then he can arrest that person. And we've seen it in concerts, for example, policemen arresting women for dancing, for example. And then it really depends from which family you come from. So if your family considers that you've been legitimately arrested, then you will stay in prison and you will be sentenced, sometimes even as a terrorist, at the specialized criminal courts. But if you have a family that won't accept it, then you're protected. So again, the male guardianship system is still existent. It is still profound, and it still controls women. The other thing is that we've seen also, the religious police being used and still active also on social media for political reasons. We've seen that the religious police has posted that anyone who is seen as a dissident can be killed. So again, the religious police and the very foundation of the Wahhabism of the Saudi state using the religious state for political reason is still existent, and the male guardianship is still here. And as long as women cannot be part of the change, then we cannot say that there are reforms.
Are you concerned about the way this is all being reported in the United States and how some,
Absolutely,
politicians are interpreting it as as trying to put a positive spin on this?
Absolutely. And I'll go even further than this. It is actually because it has been reported as such that it's so easy to cover up the violations of what is happening in Saudi Arabia. And it's because they've managed and they've succeeded in covering up the violations. They've succeeded in, giving a false image of what is happening. And this is actually what is empowering the authorities and the very patriarchal system to still be maintained. If the world did not report on the situation as positively, then us as Saudi women, we would still be allowed to speak. But no one wants to hear Saudi voices anymore because everyone believes the Saudi narrative. And so we've emboldened an authority that is actually doubling down on repression and doubling down on violations against women.
Thank you. Ms. Hamidi, my perception is that international criticism seems to have had little effect on Taliban policies or decisions when it comes to the treatment of women. Is that perception correct? And do you see any positive signs at all that the Taliban could be shifting or adjusting their views? And are the views within the Taliban monolithic?
Thank you very much. You're very much right, Congressman, because what we see is in the past 2 years, international community has mostly relied on statements and social media reactions when it comes to the Taliban's human rights violations, in particular the violations that the Taliban are committing against women and girls. Imagine Afghanistan is the only country in whole world where girls beyond secondary education are not allowed to attend school. Imagine 1.2 million girls are growing up uneducated right now in Afghanistan. Their 2 years are wasted. I clearly see that the statements that the international community are making is actually making no difference. I think what is required is more unified and solid, solid actions, not words, by international community. We need to see more restrictions and more, more follow-up and more time-bound actions and demands on the Taliban to adhere with international human rights laws. For example, when we look at the travel ban that's imposed by the UN Security Council Sanction Committee, while in words, the travel ban on the Taliban is beautiful, in action, it is not. The Taliban members are still traveling pretty freely. I was, as an Afghan woman, I was embarrassed that Norway hosted 3 Taliban members last month in Oslo Forum. Oslo Forum used to be a place where activists, journalists, women human rights defenders were getting invited, and now they're replaced by Taliban, who are basically violating the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. It's not enough. What the international community has been doing is not enough. There has to be more pressure on the Taliban. We have seen the power of the pressure on the Taliban. The arbitrary arrests that the Taliban are committing on their critics, the human rights defenders and journalists, the global action that goes against the Taliban's such arrests. We clearly see that they react back, and the documentation of the human rights violations that are provided, that should be taken very seriously by international community, including the United States. Our reports, for example, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other human rights organizations' reports are very credible and based on a lot of hard work verification, and that's where the Taliban's human rights violations should not be justified with humanitarian crisis, should not be justified with saying we have to give Taliban a chance. We have given the Taliban 2 years, and I think it's enough to do it anymore.
Thank you. Youssoufian, Ms. Youssoufian, if I could ask you a couple of questions. How do disability rights intersect with women's rights, and how does your advocacy for disability rights shape your advocacy for women's rights and vice versa? And if you could also respond to how have last year's protests affected the women's rights movement in Iran? I mean, where do things stand as we all gather here today?
Yeah, thank you. Regarding the intersection, this is an intersection that has actually driven me where I'm right now, because I think there are lessons from both sides to the other. So, for example, from the disability movement, we learn how working together and being tolerant about diversity, because people with disabilities are a diverse group, helps the movement to succeed. And that's something that I'm taking with me to my women's rights advocacy work. So, for example, it's not just for women who are not religious. this is for women with all types of beliefs from all different groups. That's the lesson that, of course, I use in my women's rights advocacy work, and I think that that's really helpful. Regarding your second question, I would say, well, many women in Iran are believing that they're not going to go back to before September 22nd, 2022, because which was basically around the time that the movement of women life freedom started in Iran. So that's for sure. It's not there would be no backward. However, the crackdown by the government is tremendous and requires for immediate action of support. If I may, Congressman, I can share, because it's a big question about, like, sanction, and if what actually the government of the United States, the United Nations, and others can do to help this movement. Because yes, in answering your question, the women's rights movement in Iran is now focused on a few key requests: no punishment, no violation of human rights for not wearing hijab, and that's what people call optional hijab, optional clothing. That's what people call it in Iran right now. And interestingly enough, many women who actually choose to wear hijab also support that, which is great. And the other recent development in this regard is the support of men and other groups that were not beforehand, they were not like very much supportive, but after this recent movement, I can tell that different groups, including men and lawyers, for example, have been more supportive. Journalists have been supportive of women's rights movement. So in the past, the women's rights movement in Iran was more isolated. Right now, we have the support of different groups, which in my opinion is an interesting development.
Well, thank you, Ms. Begum. Last March, Iraq approved a national strategy for Iraqi women 2023 to 2030. And the Prime Minister said his government intends to move to empower women and help them take their full role in all fields. How do you view this strategy? And can it be an effective tool for improving women's rights?
Thank you. It's a really important initiative to finally have a strategy from that we see for the next 7 years. However, what we've seen so far is the authorities have not made concerted efforts to really combat violence against women, both in terms of the discriminatory laws and policies that exist to expose women to that, but also the mechanisms that have failed, that simply do not exist to protect women. As I've described, we already have a situation where you have laws that provide for impunity around violence against women, such as the law that allows rapists to escape prosecution if they marry their victims, to murders of women that can be excused and you get reduced sentences if it's deemed as honorable motives. And the fact that this draft law on violence against women has been pending in Parliament for years. It's been incredible to see how the authorities have not done enough to really push it forward. Half the country in the Middle East and North Africa region now have laws on domestic violence. This is not an issue anymore that authorities esteem to be controversial, but in Iraq, it's still a very controversial issue. And it's partly because of this idea of the need for authority and control over women, that families and male guardians must have that authority, and that any incursion by the state on this is an incursion on the men's right over their women. And so we really need to see the authorities take a concerted effort to repeal these discriminatory laws and policies and to really push through a very strong law. Without those two components, we'll continue to see serious violence against women. Other things that we've seen the state do is that they work hand in hand with families, like the fact that the police actually conducts raids on NGO shelters who've been trying to host victims of violence. Some of these NGO shelters have very recently had to shut down. The women's rights activists who have been doing this work for a long time are finding a very difficult space to continue that work. So it's incredibly important that we have US authorities really pushing to ensure that civic space exists for women in Iraq in the same the way that they should push for this in Saudi Arabia and in other countries. It's incredibly important. Without that, we will not see the kinds of reforms that we want to see in these countries.
Let me just also ask you, the UAE ranks surprisingly well when it comes to legal discrimination. Its ranking is significantly higher than all of the countries that we're discussing. The World Economic Forum ranks the UAE #1 in the region for addressing the gender gap. My question is, does the reality on the ground match these rankings? If so, are there lessons to be learned from the UAE or for other countries?
The UAE has been incredibly sophisticated in terms of the narrative it's chosen to pursue. It seeks to look very good on gender, but the reality is very, very much a mismatch. What we've seen happen is fairly superficial reforms of the laws, for instance. So in the last 5 years, they've made a number of reforms. For instance, they have an anti-discrimination law that now includes gender, which is a really important step. Except the anti-discrimination law on gender does very little to actually allow for women to take cases to court when they are facing discrimination in practice. We saw them remove the language around women obeying their husbands, but they still left in situations in which women can be deemed disobedient if they do certain things, including refusing to have sex with their husbands. They've also made some changes. So the ones I described, which reflect the fact that the UAE's legal reforms are designed for some women and not all women. So the personal status laws regarding marriage, divorce, and children inheritance is now changed. So if you're a foreign national couple, it doesn't have to apply to you if you've married elsewhere. In Abu Dhabi, if you're a non-Muslim foreign national living in Abu Dhabi, you could benefit from a much stronger law. But if you're a Muslim and you're a British woman, that the UAE's discriminatory laws will still apply to you. Or if you are, an Emirati but Christian woman, it will still apply to you. So there are the problems of in which the authorities are tweaking things to make it look good on a very superficial basis, but otherwise they're reserving a lot of that discrimination, particularly for Emirati women and Muslim women. And so we're still continuing to see that in practice. And as the other laws have come in, like the domestic violence law, which was really important, we're still seeing that really centered around male guardianship. And in the same way, I'd like to reflect the fact that Saudi Arabia is trying to do the same thing. They've seen the UAE do a very good job over the years of carving out a PR narrative that they are good on women's rights. And likewise, Saudi Arabia wants the same kind of accolades without actually making serious reforms. And we want to push back on this. We want to make it clear that you cannot do these reforms without a civic society. The UAE does not have a proper civic space for women. Any spaces that you see around women's rights are done by women in institutions. They're government institutions, women, but you don't have an independent space for women's rights activists in the UAE.
So I think what I'm learning from all of you, all right, is that we can't just take at face value the press releases that these governments put out to make us all think that they're progressive and forward-thinking when it comes to women's rights. That we actually have to pay more attention and listen to the organizations and the groups and the women on the ground about what the reality is, because the press releases don't seem to match the reality. And and again, this if we're seriously talking about women's rights, I mean, it has to be about improving women's rights, period. Now I have some general questions, and any or all of you can comment or not. So I'm just going to pose them, and if you want to respond, just respond. Okay. What factors help explain why women in the Middle East and Afghanistan face so much discrimination and fare poorly on so many indicators? I mean, how much is due to adherence to religious law? You can raise your hand if you want. I can. Is Haftul, do you want to speak?
I see Ratna has raised her hand. I'll maybe speak just after her.
Okay. Ms. Begum, I didn't see your hand. Okay, go ahead.
No problem. Yes, so I would say what we've seen across the region is authorities finding religion and tradition and culture as useful defenses for why they're doing badly in women's rights. Often the way that they're using this is actually not just as a defense, but as a way of really consolidating power. We've seen authorities acquiesce to very patriarchal factions where they're gaining legitimacy. It's partly, in some countries, it's an issue where the regime in question, the governing administration, sees that it can get power from more conservative alliances. So in countries like Saudi Arabia, and Lina can talk a lot more to this, the Saudi state has made an alliance with the Wahhabi, very conservative interpretation of religion, which they don't need to. They could have far more progressive interpretations, but they chose a much more restrictive interpretation because they found it useful as part of the legitimacy of their state. It's also the way in which, understanding of things like male guardianship by states in which they, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, states that really don't have a democratic legitimacy, they are having to wield their power over their people. And in doing so, they are giving powers to others, control of humans over other humans. And in that sense, we're seeing something like male guardianship in which men can control other women as a state sort of social contract. And that's why the citizens are then expected to sort of, be obedient to this state, which also has no legitimacy. So, we're seeing this sort of practice happen in those contexts. In other contexts, which are, more democratic or have sort of democratic functioning institutions, we see a reluctance to often change things or improve situations for women's rights because it's seen as difficult, or again because they want to acquiesce to more conservative sort of traditions, and where it's politically useful to be anti-women's rights in order to preserve power. So that's kind of the tendency we've seen. In recent years, we've sometimes seen women's rights being used as a political football, where they've actually tried to promote women's rights as if they're doing better. So Saudi Arabia is a good example of that. The UAE is a good example of that, where on the international stage, they're making claims to doing things on women's rights. But actually at home, what they're really doing is very much on the surface and ensuring that men still have control over women. So as Lina really articulated earlier with the examples, we have a situation where two different families under the same law can have a very different reality, because the authorities will are simply allowing the families to decide, male guardians to decide whether they're going to be liberal or not.
I'll go to Ms. I'll have Lul, and then I know that Ms. Yousefian has her hand up as well. So Lina, we'll go to you first.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, Mr. Begum really articulated everything very well. And I think what I really want to note is that it's always about regime survival. So for example, a couple of years ago, when my sister and the other activists were demanding the right to drive, what the government used to say is that the people are not ready. They always put it on the people. And then, in a second, they decide that women can drive and that everyone has accepted it. At the end of the day, they have never actually allowed people to express their opinion on fundamental issues. So we can't say that the people are not ready or they're ready. If activists or if the civil society cannot do its work, then mentalities and the society cannot change. So everything that has been imposed on women is about regime survival. If tomorrow MBS wants to go back to how it was 5 years ago, he will go back to how it was 5 years ago if it's about his own political interests. So at the end of the day, without civil society, without real reformers, we cannot improve the country on human rights.
Thank you. Ms. Yousefian?
I will be very brief, Rose. My colleagues actually covered it really well. I just want to mention and highlight that, for example, in a context like Iran, the controlling and manipulating women is a way of manipulating the whole society. So the government of Iran understands really well that by missing the game against women, allowing them to have their freedoms, allowing them to have their rights, and even letting them to have economic power, the society going to be empowered. Because you mentioned that yourself, Congressman, women's rights is human rights. So by guaranteeing women's rights, they're actually going to guarantee human rights. And human rights is what going to defeat this regime. And that's what they don't want. So I think they understand really well that by just restricting women, they can keep the society in the undemocratic and closed way that they keeps them in power.
Anybody else before I go to the next question? Okay. All of the countries that we're discussing today, except Iran, have ratified CEDAW. Has CEDAW been useful for women fighting for their rights in these countries? Could more be done to encourage states to enforce their obligations under CEDAW? And just raise your hand. I can. All right, Ms. Hamidi, we'll go with you first.
Thank you so much. I think CEDAW played a very important role in the past, before the collapse, the 20 years that reforms happened in Afghanistan. There was focus on a new constitution, which was basically considered a moderate constitution in South Asia when the discussion around rights and obligation of women and men were discussed. Similarly, there were so many other efforts that were underway, for example, by Ministry of Women's Affairs, by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, then by civil society, by women organizations. The organization that I was leading, Afghan Women's Network, CEDAW was one of the main tools for us to basically put more pressure on more equity and equality based policies, reforms, and strategies in Afghanistan, within the central system in Kabul, but also at the provincial level. I think CEDAW also gave a lot of opportunity for international community to engage with the former government and to put pressure and to question the former government on the progress that the government was making in terms of the women's rights in Afghanistan. I mean, even now, as I said in my testimony, Afghanistan, no matter who is the authority, has ratified these international human rights treaties. CEDAW is one of them, and that's where Afghanistan, whoever leads or controls the country, has to basically adhere to it, and that's where our legal analysis in our recent report basically weighed in how these international laws are violated by the Taliban and what should be done. And international community, member states, as you rightly said, they can do a lot looking into such laws, for example, CEDAW.
Ms. Begum?
Thank you. I agree with Ms. Mira Hamidi. In the Middle East and North Africa, we've seen CEDAW was being used as a tool by women's rights activists and NGOs quite effectively, and they have found it incredibly powerful to use to hold their governments to account, particularly during the reporting period, and to try and push for a momentum on reforms. We have, however, seen these governments at very periodic times who try to, again, we've talked about this, where they use religion, tradition, or culture to defend why they cannot implement CEDAW. And for those who don't know what CEDAW is the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And so we tend to see states try to defend why they're not doing it, often using religion as a reason. But CEDAW is very clear on this, that there's an expectation under the text for states, parties to actually reform traditions and actually make inroads within society as well, to actually root out discrimination in practice. So this is a state obligation in and of itself, and it cannot be used as a defense for why states cannot implement CEDAW.
Thank you. What I hate about Zoom is every time someone speaks, you all move around. So Ms. Al-Hathulu, I'll yield to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just maybe add something. Yes, of course, it's a very important instrument, and that it has led to positive changes. But when we are in a situation like Saudi Arabia today, where everything is secret, everything is behind closed door, and So there are two Saudi Arabias, one that the world sees. So with Saudi Arabia ratifying these instruments and going to the CEDAW and, talking about all these changes and, the narrative of reforms and so on. But what is actually happening on the ground is that activists have in their charges explicitly the fact that they've engaged with the UN. So at the end of the day, I think that it's very important now to unveil what is happening in Saudi Arabia. And this is where the US can come in with, for example, really pushing for trials to be monitored, that they're not behind closed doors anymore, that prisons are also visited by independent monitors, because at the end, if activists are actually sentenced and charged as terrorists for engaging with the UN, for talking about CEDAW, for talking about all these conventions, then it won't lead us anywhere. It's only about, again, PR from the Saudi government. So for me, it's about really uncovering, unveiling, and opening the doors to what is really happening on the ground in Saudi Arabia.
And this next question, it might be helpful if all of you briefly comment on this next question. What role do men play in sustaining the unequal treatment of women? I mean, have men been allies in the fight for women's rights? How do women's rights advocates approach the need to change deeply embedded social attitudes and expectations that restrict women's roles in society? Maybe Ms. Hamidi, we'll begin with you, because I'm just looking at the screen, so.
Yeah, sure. Well, it has been, I would say, quite a complex situation when it comes to men's engagement, particularly in the past 2 years. Those men who are inside Afghanistan, of course, there is a lot of expectation. There is a lot of comparison between Iranian men and Afghan men, and there is also a lot of criticism on Afghan men, saying you're not doing enough the way the men in Iran are standing with Iranian women. However, the justification we are getting from men inside Afghanistan is that they can face severe Taliban's inhuman treatment and imprisonment, enforced disappearances, torture, and everything as compared to women. I think the situation has shaken people so much in Afghanistan during the collapse that we do see some good number of men who are active in exile, who are trying to speak for women's rights, who try to write about the women and girls situation and also advocate. But as I started saying, it's very complex. It is very complex. While there is some little support, there is also, I would say, criticism. There is also negative observation. Afghanistan is unfortunately a very diverse and culturally focused country. There are men in Afghanistan who are actually supporting the Taliban's policies on women right now, who were against women's rights and empowerment of women in the past 20 years also. So it's fairly low, I would say. I have not seen, a bravery action by Afghan men to simply to get out of their homes and say no to the Taliban's restriction on girls' education. Right to education is nowhere banned in religion and culture and in international law, but that little bravery is also not seen. I have not witnessed it, and it's a little disappointing. So that's how I can explain the situation.
With you, Safian?
Well, I would say we have both extremes. As Samira said, we have men who go to prison and lose their lives for women, and also women's rights. And also, I want to give a couple of examples from divorce and inheritance laws. So you know that divorce laws in Iran, for example, are very discriminatory, and women, unless for very exceptional situations, they cannot seek divorce without the consent of the husband. But many men try to go before the marriage. They try to do some private contract. You know, there are ways under the law that I don't want to take so much time to explain that. But men trying to sign and leave their consent in advance that the woman has the power to divorce. Or we have families, you know, in Iran, according to Iranian law, for example, sons' inheritance is twice than daughters. But in many families, brothers agree to give equal, to get equal. That means that they are accepting some financial loss with their sisters, or fathers take initiative to do legal measures that all their children inherit the same. These are great positive measures, but at the same time, we have horrendous cases of femicide, we have horrendous cases of violence against women, we have acid attacks in Iran, which were never really prosecuted. We have men who actually enjoy these restrictions on women's hijab. We have men who threat women in the street that you should wear your hijab. So we have both extremes, I have to say. And that's how we understand like education, access to information is so important to have more allies.
Ms. El Hathloul.
Thank you very much. Yes, I must say, I mean, it's the problem is the system. The fact that you have a system that has imposed, you know, these mentalities that since they're born, men know that they have this power, they won't change overnight. But the thing is that even men who are who stand in solidarity with women's rights activists, with women safe have the same faith. For example, I really want to talk about Hamad al-Rabi'a, who was actually arrested with my sister, and he is the most feminist man I've ever met. Honestly, he is still in prison and facing decades in prison for his activism and feminism and for standing in solidarity with women's rights activists. So at the end, I mean, we can't say, at least in Saudi Arabia, I think we can't really say, you know, whether men are with or without women, as long as women cannot talk, they cannot speak freely, they cannot do the job in really changing mentalities, in speaking up and, you know, demanding their own rights, then mentalities won't change, and men have been educated this way. So it's a systematic problem. It comes from the top, and as long as there is no civil society, then we can't really blame anyone but the system, I would say.
Ms. Begum, any words?
I have to just agree with everyone else what they've said in terms of, you know, you do see men as allies in many respects, but also men who commit terrible violence and discrimination. But as I also want to build on what Lena just mentioned, it is the way in which the states are responsible. When we talk about male guardianship, it's where we see the state is providing men with this level of control over women's lives. So yes, there are women who have male guardians that are very supportive and allow them to live their lives freely. But the actual act, the concept of male guardianship disturbs the entire balance of families and society, because what it does is it completely changes the family dynamic and that relationship. I have women telling me how they had to go to the younger brothers for permission in order to travel abroad, or they needed their brother's permission in order to get married. And in that moment, the authority has completely changed and their brothers were in a position of power. And you can have an argument with your sibling as you would normally, but now your sibling has this huge amount of authority over your life that they otherwise would normally not have done. And that creates such a bridge that creates terrible ruptures in families for years to come because of this terrible unequal level of power between the genders. And it also, in terms of like when we talk about discrimination against women and why, even though it gives men this power, it provides for not just, women don't have human rights, but it also means you have unequal societies that are unfair. That means it creates more violence that is in itself very harmful to men as well. So understanding that women's rights are human rights, but women's rights are important for a free and fair society for everyone to live in is crucial.
Thank you. Let me ask you, and you all may want to comment on this. Well, and I promise I'm trying to be mindful of your time as well, but just a couple more questions, if that's okay. But how do you assess U.S. efforts to promote women's rights in the countries in or on which you've worked? I mean, are U.S. strategies sufficiently sensitive to local level culture and political dynamics? Are there conditions under which U.S. support for your work is not helpful? And how can we be as constructive as possible in supporting your efforts and those of women on the ground? Why don't we begin with Ms. Yousefian? You
Sure.
can be honest, by the way. I want you to be as honest as
No, I mean, I will be honest, because a couple of days ago we heard about this deal between the United States and Iran about like bringing Iranian American prisoners back home, which is great. But I'm sure there has been a lot promised in addition to the financial, like sending the money back to Iran, which, I mean, this is a very, very complicated conversation. But what I can say for sure that the government of the United States can do and should do more is to support access to information. People in Iran will find their way if they have access to internet connection, safe and unfiltered. Because what brought the women life freedom movement was the social media, was access to information. So I think if women in Iran could have access, and men in Iran could have access to information, could communicate with each other freely and learn about the women's rights values, human rights values, they would find their way. That's one thing. And the second thing that I think should be done is to support the civil society Iran truly support, especially in international communities. Like we had this briefing by the Security Council, which was very powerful. Unfortunately, didn't continue. So using all the international mechanisms at hand to give opportunity to people in Iran to speak for themselves. We don't want any country to come and change the government for us. We want the equipment to change our lives ourselves. So, I mean, and those equipment, knowledge, access to information, access to international platforms is something that governments, including the government of the United States, can offer.
Ms. Hamidi?
I think it's there are mixed feelings when it comes to the United States support to Afghan women, especially when the collapse happened, and unfortunately that continues. From 2010, when international community and the former government decided that they will go with a peace and reintegration program with the Taliban, Afghan women were leading the peace process from their perspective, saying we want peace, we want end of conflict and bloodshed, but we don't want any compromise on our rights. We would like to continue where we are. We would like to be politically engaged. We would like to have right to education, right to work, and all other freedoms that today they don't have. At times they were ignored. At times they were not listened to. And with the U.S. and Taliban Doha deal, I think the plight of Afghan women were completely ignored. And the miseries that are brought to women and girls today by the Taliban is the result of irresponsible decisions and irresponsible withdrawal from Afghanistan by international community led by the United States, I would say. I think there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of criticism still, especially when the U.S. officials meet the Taliban in Doha, when they give them the space, when they discuss with them different fronts, whereas their human rights track record has been extremely violent, has been extremely concerning. And just the recent meeting that were held by Special Representative Tom West and Special Envoy Rina Amiri was not welcomed by a lot of people from Afghanistan, especially women and girls. So I think as I stated in my recommendation, also there's a need for the U.S. government to increase its engagement directly with women and girls, to provide them the platforms to hear, to listen to them, to ask for possible solutions. Find ways to support those women organizations and women groups, especially women protesters who are still very active inside Afghanistan. They are pretty much active. They are challenging the Taliban every day. And that's where I think of course, I applaud their bravery, but they have very limited support. They have very limited access to funding, for example, access to other resources. And I think that's where the US government can play a very good role. And thirdly, I think engaging with Afghan women activists and organizations in exile who are now trying to, re-engage, who are trying to see how they can support different human rights fronts addressing the situation in Afghanistan would be very important. Providing more fellowships for Afghan women activists in the US, for example, providing more opportunities of engagement at the policy level would be, of course, very important.
Ms. Begun?
Thank you. I agree with the other panelists. I think really it's about ensuring that the US is making efforts to create that, to support the civic space in many of these countries. So in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, for instance, where there is a non-existent civic space because of the sheer repression by the state. It's not enough to hear that they're doing well on women's rights or whatever superficial level reforms they're talking about. It's really important to inquire about whether the space is available for women's rights activists, where they are, whether they're able to provide, just to give an example, the personal status law that the Saudi Arabia authorities passed in March 2022, it was never made public before it was actually passed. So no public member was really able to give input or to consult, or let alone for women's rights activists to campaign around it. So, just that's the kind of thing that we want to see happening in order for women's rights activists to be able to demand these types of reforms. I would also look at opportunities, so upcoming opportunities like COP28 that's taking place in the United Arab Emirates. It's a good opportunity to use that as a forum to push for what they're doing on women's rights and specifically around civic society. Again, this is a police state in which they're hosting this very important conference on the environment, and yet we don't have women's rights activists who are able to speak out about what's happening in their own country, and we have a lot of people flying into this space as well. So I think these are the kinds of things we'd like to see the US authorities do. At the same time, supporting the cause that they're already making, they're very simple and very, which is, repeal discriminatory laws and policies, including male guardianship, pushing for the kinds of laws that women are fighting for, and supporting them in solidarity as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Al-Hathou.
Thank you very much. I agree with what everyone said. I'll just add that in Saudi Arabia, the country, as you know, is trying to open up, and there's really a war of narratives. And I think it's very important for the US not to repeat the narrative that the Saudis are providing. I think it's very important to be critical when it comes to women's rights in Saudi Arabia, and again, yes, supporting civil society. And I was very shocked actually during Mr. Blinken's last visit in Saudi Arabia, where he met with what he called women's civil societies. I didn't know any of these women at the end of the day. They're not, I'm sorry to say, they're mouthpieces of the government. They can't do the work. There is no real civil society. I mean, no one has asked to really meet my sister, for example, Lujain, or any of the other activists. No one has really asked for, the Salma Shihab, who is in prison just for tweeting on feminist hashtags. So at the end, the more the more we repeat the Saudi narrative, the more we embolden them, and the more they can cover up and double down on repression. So it's very just important to counter that narrative, to give civil society, especially the ones in the diaspora, a voice, and yeah, to make the Saudis know that whatever they do to cover up the violations, it will be known, and it won't be accepted.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think this discussion is important, because it helps highlight the reality and not just a narrative that's being put up by a particular government. look, I have one final question, and then if you want to add anything that you think is important for the record, this is the opportunity to do that. But when it comes to women's rights, are there any bright spots in the region that we should highlight? And also, are there any things that you think are important that we need to add to the record that we're not asked? And so we'll just go around. Ms. El Hathul, we'll begin with you. Any bright spots, and then what else do we need to have for the record for this discussion here?
Well, I'll say maybe one good thing is the fact that women have had recently important positions, which might, which might just make people comfortable and habituated to seeing women in such positions. But I should also emphasize on the fact that these very women are not free in what they do and what they think and what they say. For example, the first female ambassador, the first female Saudi ambassador was in Norway, was actually part of the Saudi Human Rights Commission that visited my sister, and she saw that my sister was brutally tortured. And after leaving prison and denying the torture, she was appointed ambassador. So we see that these women, they are not free in what they do. They're not, they're not empowering women, but they're just being part of a PR campaign, unfortunately.
Samiri?
Unfortunately, I drew a very grim situation for women and girls in Afghanistan, and there is very little I can say in terms of the opportunity. But I think, as I said earlier, also the fact that there are so many Afghan women and girls in Afghanistan who have still not given up, who are still protesting the Taliban's repression, is an opportunity for us, especially for international community, to strategically think about a unified action to dismantle the Taliban's repression against women and girls, the gender persecution, which may amount to crimes against humanity. I think the more we engage with women on the ground and those Afghan women who are working on Afghanistan's human rights situation, the better it will be to get address and to get ideas and recommendations on the possible solutions is something that I would like to propose concluding my remarks. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Ms. Yusefian?
Well, I think the bright spot is this women life and freedom movement in Iran, such a pioneering and developed way of asking for women's rights and human rights. So I know that peace in the Middle East is something that all governments in the U.S. are trying to enhance, all governments at international level are trying to enhance. And I think if we believe, all of us, that without human rights, sustainable peace is not possible, without women's rights, sustainable peace is not achievable, then just by supporting people, giving them the platform, and I want to repeat that if technically, I guess it's possible, if we invest on and make sure that people have access to free and unfiltered internet, for example, in a country like Iran, so they can progress with their civil requests. I'm sure that the peace, freedom, and human rights is not that far from our region. But I think this is something that should be looked at as a long-term investment, not looking at peace in the Middle East with short-term deals, but bringing those prisoners back home is fantastic. But this is not going to be sustainable, because I myself, I'm an Iranian American citizen here, sitting here. I cannot go back to my country because I know that with this deal that they are seeking right now, no one is safe, no dual national is safe. So I really want to request to have this long-term holistic approach to human rights, women's rights, peace and security and justice, accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Begum.
Well, I issued a report just a month ago trying to examine women's freedom of movement across the entire Middle East and North Africa region. And I can say in terms of positive news, most of the countries now allow women to obtain passports and to travel abroad without male guardian permission. And that is credit to the women's rights activists over decades for their work. And it's really looking at the fact that they succeeded because they campaigned, they used their constitutional laws, they protested, they found ways to demand their rights over years. And acknowledging how we got that success is what we need to do going forward, which is that women's rights, as just been mentioned by everyone else, it has to be core to anything that's being discussed, whatever area it is. This must be core to that, and particularly ensuring that that space exists for women to be able to do that kind of campaigning for effective reforms as well. So, in Iran, there's lots of terrible things going on, but at the same time, it's incredibly heartening and inspiring to see how women are, going about trying to fight this incredible discrimination that they've been facing for so many years. But I think the US in many ways could be a good ally for women's rights activists around the region, in trying to support them and the space that they exist in to get the reforms that they need so that they can live their lives without fear and in security.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just say to all of you, I mean, I really, I think this was a very powerful discussion. I appreciate your clarity. I appreciate your courage. I appreciate your advocacy. And, as we've all kind of said one way or another, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And I've always felt that if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And we're not always consistent, and we're not always there when we need to be there. We need to do better. I want to disseminate this conversation to as many of my colleagues as I can, and to those in the administration who may not be listening to this as we're having this discussion right now. I worry not just about the uphill climb in so many countries to achieve women's rights. I also have come to appreciate the fact that even when rights are achieved, that doesn't mean they can't be taken away. And in the United States, I mean, we are having a unfortunate discussion around the fact that it seems to be we're going backwards on women's rights in many respects, and I think so. It's not just about getting them; it's about sustaining them and making sure that that they're there for forever. But I am, I appreciate the complexities and the nuances of foreign policy. I understand the challenges that the Secretary of State, no matter who is president, has to deal with in terms of trying to achieve certain policy objectives. But I get frustrated, as I know many of you do, when oftentimes human rights are put to the side. You can talk about nuclear disarmament. You can talk about, economic reforms. You can talk about whatever you want to and still talk about human rights. Because, and I sometimes worry that human rights gets sacrificed because, well, we can't talk about it because we need to get X, Y, or Z. Human rights needs to be at the table at all times. But I think this has been a very powerful discussion. I thank you all, and we will stay in touch. But I appreciate all the work that you do. So with that, we will conclude this discussion. I wish you all the very best for a good weekend, and we will talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.